establishment archaeology regards Atlantis as a joke and doesn't take it seriously at all. The view of establishment archaeology is that Atlantis was a fiction made up by the Greek philosopher Plato. The earliest surviving reference in writing that we have to Atlantis, in writing that we can read, is the work of Plato. And it's in the dialogues known as the Timaeus and the Critias. And he speaks about this great civilization based upon an island, which was at one time nurturing, kind, gentle, loving, but as gradually became delirious with power and began to impose its power upon other peoples around the world. And eventually the universe struck it down with this enormous flood, and Atlantis was submerged beneath the sea. Now, Egyptologists reject all of this. There is also a mention of Athens in the Atlantis story as it's passed down to us by Plato, and archaeologists in general rightly point out that there was no Athens at that time. Now, unlike many ancient myths, Plato's story of Atlantis actually contains a very specific date. Here's the provenance of that story. A famous Greek lawmaker called Solon traveled to Egypt around 600 BC. Did a kind of tour of Egypt with a translator. And on that tour, he stopped off at a temple in the Delta dedicated to the goddess Neith, the temple of Sais. And there he saw enormous inscriptions on the walls, and he asked local priests to translate those inscriptions for him. And those inscriptions told the story of Atlantis. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word. We're looking at a word that made its way from ancient Egyptian into Greek. We're getting a Greek word with Atlantis. But that word was the result of a translation done in 600 BC by a priest for Solon. And then Plato inherits that story, and he embeds it into the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias. Here's the point. The priest that gave the translation, Solon asked him, when did this happen? When was Atlantis swallowed up by the sea? And the priest replied, quite matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. That's where we need to do the math. Solon was there in 600 BC.
11,500.
So we're now talking about 9,600 BC, which is 11,600 years ago, give or take 20 years. And that turns out to coincide exactly with what is called meltwater pulse 1b. There was an enormous rise in sea level at that exact time, around 11,600 years ago. So if Plato just made up the date that was given to Solon, it's extraordinary that it coincides with the latest geological evidence on meltwater pulse 1b, when islands could have been swallowed up by the sea.
Prem, how hard could it be if you look at the patterns in the middle of the ocean, whatever the location would be, how hard is it for archaeologists to say, yeah, that makes sense, something could have been here?
Well,
what is their argument to say that?
It's very hard for them to say it, because it means admitting that there was a lost civilization, which is something that archaeologists don't want to do. However, they say that the reason they think it's a fantasy is because Athens is mentioned in it, and there was no Athens then, and because it appears to be trying to teach moral lessons about how a society can become overconfident and overproud and be brought down. I get it. But what they don't do, and what they should do, and I've never seen this done in any critique of Atlantis, is they do not inform others that there are roughly 200 myths from all around the world that speak of a global flood, of a global cataclysm that submerged and destroyed a prior civilization. And I think the Atlantis story has to be seen in context of those global flood myths. So certainly I believe that Plato drew the idea from an ancient Egyptian original, but he then used that idea to make political points as well. But the idea itself isn't a unique or rare idea. It's found in hundreds of flood myths all around the world, and Atlantis is one of those flood myths. So I'm actually very sure that Atlantis is a genuine story. Exactly where or what Atlantis was is something that requires further work. But one important development is that there is one temple in Egypt that's left standing which still contains the Atlantis account. The temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt has inscribed on its walls what are called the Edfu building texts. And when I first started working with those texts, I was working with translations that were done in the 1960s. And they were partial translations, but they talk briefly about a primeval homeland of the gods, which was an island, which was struck by something like a serpent that came down out of the sky and split the island, and then the island was swallowed up by the sea. There were survivors. They headed off in all directions. and some of them came to Egypt. And there in Egypt, they built what are called primeval mounds. And those primeval mounds were to be the basis, the foundation of all future temples and pyramids that would be built in Egypt. The problem with the Edfu building text is the Temple of Edfu is a Ptolemaic temple. It dates to about 280 BC, and that is after Plato. There's two things clear. We're looking at a body of information that was preserved on the walls of a number of temples, of which the last surviving is the Temple of Horus at Edfu. And secondly, those words, the language that is used in the hieroglyphs of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, is not the language of 280 BC. It's not Ptolemaic Egyptian. It's Middle Kingdom Egyptian. It's language that's 2000 BC. And states quite clearly that what they were doing was making permanent, by carving them into the walls, material that was in the ancient archives of the prior temple that had stood on Edfu. It turns out that the latest version of the Temple of Edfu is indeed only the latest version, that it stands on the foundations of an older temple, which stood on the foundations of an older temple, etc., etc. The archives were preserved, and in Ptolemaic times they were permanently put on the walls of the temple. The Middle Egyptian is important, the antiquity of the language in which these are inscribed in Ptolemaic times, and the fact that there is a reference to 7,000 years ago, this great flood. And when you add 7 to 2000 BC, you get to 9,000, very close to the date that was given to Solon. So I think that Egyptologists and archaeologists should be a little more generous and perhaps a little more open-minded in looking at the Atlantis story, and above all should connect it to other traditions of civilizations destroyed in a global flood.
Okay.